All right, hello and welcome to day number 76, video number 76, joined as always by the two eminent presidents, George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and back once again, my daughter Jocelyn. So, I've talked a lot about Teddy Roosevelt in these videos. I've had multiple videos that have dealt with Teddy Roosevelt, and I think I've made it pretty clear that I'm pretty fascinated with Teddy Roosevelt. He's not the only Roosevelt that was interesting. A lot of his family was very interesting too, and I think maybe his daughter Alice was one of the most interesting Roosevelts. So I'm going to talk today about Alice Roosevelt a little bit. So Alice was his oldest child, Teddy Roosevelt's oldest child. And you might remember from an earlier video that his first wife had passed away only 2 days after childbirth, and that was Alice Roosevelt's mother, her name also being Alice. She died from some kind of kidney ailment 2 days after she was born. And I mentioned in that previous video that Teddy Roosevelt was so distraught that he basically could not bear to think about his previous wife, who was very much, it was his dead wife, who he was very much in love with. And so he's so distraught that he wouldn't even refer to his new daughter as Alice. He referred to her as Baby Lee because he couldn't bring himself to say the name Alice. And she often went by Lee through much of her life, but also as Alice as she got older, but particularly as a young girl, as Baby Lee. Teddy, who was so distraught, he basically left and went out west, built a ranch, and for a lot of the young years, he was not around. His sister Bamie, Teddy's sister Bamie, took care of young Alice, but eventually Teddy did remarry Edith Caro, and so they then basically took Alice back into the home and raised her from that point on. But as often happens with the case of daughters and stepmothers, her stepmother and Alice did not get along very well. Teddy was gone for long periods of time on business and other ventures out west or whatever else, and so she was often at home with her stepmother and did not want to take direction very much from her. While she revered her father, her stepmother not so much. So there are some some stories about the two of them going back and forth, but I won't get into those too much today. But I will tell one story that with Teddy and Edith decided that when she was a teenager that they wanted to send her to like an elite boarding school, and they told her that this was what they were planning to do, and she did not want to go, and she told her father, she said, if you send me, I will do something to humiliate you. I promise you I will do this. And so they never sent her. Like I said, she was a very strong-willed young lady. So in 1901, Teddy Roosevelt becomes president with the death of William McKinley, which puts Alice into the White House, where she was mischievous as ever. She was known as basically a partier and somebody who played pranks and things like that. She smoked cigarettes in public, which was unheard of for women at that time. She also rode in cars with men, unchaperoned, which again, that was even more scandalous at that time. She just basically flaunted the rules of society. Once she was in the chamber of the House of Representatives, and she was watching the proceedings for some reason, and she was bored, and so she put a tack under a man's seat, and when he sat down, well, he sat on the tack, and you might imagine the result. And she just did it essentially to amuse herself. She could be pretty rowdy. Once Teddy sent her with a U.S. delegation on a tour to Japan with the Secretary of War, future President William Howard Taft, who was this time Secretary of War. He was part of this big American delegation anyways, and Alice was there too. And while she was on this trip, there were stories of her gambling with the men and smoking cigars, and there was a confirmed story definitely of her once jumping into a pool fully clothed and then talking to a congressman who was also on the trip into doing the same thing. So and this was, she was somebody who was sort of followed by the press. She was kind of a wild child, so there was a lot of press coverage of what Alice Roosevelt was doing and things like that. So so she got a lot of press coverage for some of these things that she was doing. Um, when they left the White House, she did not like the Tafts. The Tafts were moving in. Roosevelt didn't run for re-election in 1908. He was just done. William Howard Taft was going in, and she did not care for the Tafts too much, and so she buried a voodoo doll of Mrs. Taft in the White House lawn in an effort to bring them bad luck. She was eventually banned from coming back to the White House by the Tafts because of some nasty things she had said about them in public. Basically, she revered her father so much that no one could match up, and so she couldn't help but kind of come after them. And she had an acerbic wit, to say the least. She was very smart, and she could be a little bit nasty when she wanted to be. And so after her father died, she stayed involved really in politics. She was very politically connected. She lived in Washington, D.C. She knew everybody. Everybody knew who Alice was. And she actually exerted a little bit of political influence, and people liked to be around her. She was a vivacious person, very outgoing, fun. But she could also, like I said before, she could certainly she wouldn't hold back her thoughts on you. She was very critical of her own relative, Franklin Roosevelt, when he was in office. Said all kinds of public things about him and about her first cousin, who was Eleanor Roosevelt, FDR's wife. So she didn't hold back on them. She went after JFK. She was actually friends with Nixon and but she actually went after Nixon. She was not real happy with Nixon either at times. Friends with Bobby Kennedy. So anyways, a lot of political influence throughout her life. And then she died at age 96. And she lived all the way until 1980 when she was 96 years old. So she lived a pretty full life and was a pretty well-known figure excuse me, in Washington, D.C. So I will leave you with one last story of... actually, two last stories from Alice Roosevelt's life. One was while her dad was president, and she continually was causing problems for him. And one time she had come in and was interrupting him during a meeting, and she left. And he famously said to whoever was in there, he said, "I can manage the country or I can manage Alice. I cannot possibly do both." And sort of a testament to the handful she was, I guess, as a teenager, young woman. And then the other one is a great line. I love this line. Again, show you she would not hold back. That she said to Joseph McCarthy. Joseph McCarthy was from the early 1950s. He was the would accuse people of being communist. This communist witch hunt basically set forth that was all essentially a big fraud, and he was eventually discredited and everything else. And we look at it today as a pretty negative period. But in the early 1950s, he was a very powerful man. And so they were at a party once, and he came up to Alice and said, "Let's pretend that you're my blind date, and I shall call you Alice." And he knew her, of course, and she didn't like him and what he was doing. And so she looked at him and said, and I'll read the quote directly, and she said, "Senator McCarthy, you are not going to call me Alice. The truck man, the trash man, and the policeman on my block may call me Alice, but you may not." And I thought, what a great line. So she was not afraid to stand up to one of the most powerful people in Washington at that time. So anyways, that is the story of Alice Roosevelt. I hope you found it interesting. Anyways, enjoy the rest of your day. Questions tomorrow, the last question day. So if you have some questions for tomorrow's video, please send them. It is the last one. Ask me anything you want. So anyhow, we'll see you then. Bye.
Bye. Bye.